Poor girl loses a game, has to kiss stranger, not realizing he's her company's CEO, and falls for her. Imagine playing a silly game at an office party and being forced to kiss a complete stranger. Now imagine walking into work the next day and discovering that stranger is your stone-cold CEO, staring back at you from across the boardroom. That's exactly what happened to Lynn Ruan. Her heart stopped as their eyes met, recognition dawning in his gaze. Would he fire her on the spot? Would he pretend nothing happened? Or would this chance encounter lead to something neither of them expected? Lynn's ordinary life was about to become anything but, as corporate politics, hidden identities, and a mysterious past began to unravel around her. Lynn Ruan hated office parties. They always seemed to highlight her awkwardness, her preference for quiet corners over loud laughter, and most of all, her inability to stand up to relentless peer pressure. Just like now, she stood near the edge of the small crowd gathered in the brightly lit cafeteria, sipping from a half-empty punch glass. Her co-workers surrounded her, each taking turns egging her on with grins and exaggerated cheers. Ruan flattened her lips into a tight smile, trying to decline yet again. "Come on, it's just a game. Don't be boring," someone called out. The word boring stung in a strangely childish way, and before Ruan could think of yet another excuse, her name was being chanted by the growing group. "You don't want to ruin the fun, do you?" her manager added in a playful but pointed tone that left little room for argument. Ruan felt trapped. She set down her drink and reluctantly stepped forward, half wondering how she'd let herself get roped into this. It was a simple game, or so they said. Spin the bottle. No big deal, right? Wrong. Ruan was filled with instant regret as she watched the bottle spin, the glossy surface catching the light as it made slow, deliberate circles on the table. Her palms dampened as the chanting grew louder with every rotation. Her internal monologue was running at full speed now, somewhere between a mental pep talk and abject panic. "It's just a kiss. It's a silly game. Tomorrow everyone will forget it even happened." But what if they didn't? Would this be the moment they whispered about for weeks afterward? Would it haunt her every time she showed up to work? The clinking bottles slowed agonizingly before finally pointing to someone in the small crowd directly opposite her. The cheers soared, and Lynn froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't make out his face. The stranger was obscured by shadows created by the soft, uneven glow of the string lights adorning the walls. She could tell he wasn't a regular colleague. She might have noticed someone with his sheer presence before. What little she could see suggested a sharp suit and a stance that felt both laid back and vaguely commanding. He stood perfectly still, unbothered by the sudden attention. If he was uncomfortable in the chaotic atmosphere, he certainly didn't show it. His confidence, it didn't just fill the room, it owned the space. That much, even Ruan could sense, which only made her stomach tighten further. Who was he? The rules were explained quickly, perhaps too quickly. Ruan barely registered them after the bottle's final landing. All she knew was that both participants were supposed to meet halfway and make good on the prize. The chanting grew louder as the crowd pressed forward, forming a tight semicircle around them. The voices blurred, her pulse pounding in her ears so fast that it nearly drowned out everything else. "Way out now," her inner voice scolded. Ruan hesitated, her feet rooted firmly to the floor, as if refusing to comply. She cursed her luck silently. Only she could end up in such a ridiculous situation, all because she was unable to say no. A sudden cheer broke through the haze. It was for him, the stranger. He had moved first, stepping into the moon-shaped space cleared for the game. His approach was calm, unhurried. That confidence again, wrapped in an aura of control that unsettled Ruan. He stopped just short of the bottle, and for the first time, she got a clearer glimpse of his face. It wasn't youthful, like most of her male co-workers. No, his features were sharply defined, his expression unreadable, but somehow magnetic. His dark eyes surveyed her briefly, but gave away nothing. Strangely, he seemed more amused than anything else. "Are we doing this or not?" he asked, his tone cool, yet not impatient. That one sentence sent another ripple through the crowd, this time quieter. Rowan sensed the pressure shift back to her again. She almost wanted to laugh bitterly. This was just a silly game, and yet her mind made it feel like a monumental decision. A thread of self-reflection cracked through her anxiety. How did the tiniest, most ridiculous moments take on a life of their own? How did life twist itself into these odd, pivotal points? Research would agree. High-pressure social situations often shoved people into moments far afield of their normal behavior. Ruan knew this, even from her own years of observation. Yet here she was, centered in one herself. Her breathing quickened as she tried to gather what little resolve she had left. Her hand brushed against her skirt, a nervous reflex, and she took an agonizingly small step forward. Once she moved, everything else blurred together. His soft, steady gaze grounded her slightly as she half-closed the distance. The cheers were background noise, nothing registering except the oddly overwhelming sense of awareness prickling through her. Awkwardly at first, but not unkindly, her opposite leaned in slightly, his closeness tangible now. When their lips met, it wasn't what Lin Ruan expected, not rushed or performative, as some part of her feared. It wasn't mind-blowing either, not in ways she'd have consciously anticipated. But as their brief contact began and ended, almost in one seamless motion, she felt the faintest, inexplicable pull. It wasn't chemistry in the traditional sense, more akin to déjà vu, as if she'd stumbled across an anchor, unknown but strangely familiar. Maybe that was all her adrenaline stretching the truth of what objectively lasted barely a heartbeat. Or maybe not. Whatever it was, Ruan didn't stick around to analyze it. The moment had passed before her shock could fold back into embarrassment. She took a full step backward before an appropriate response settled into place. That was it. The crowd burst into cheers, sharper than ever, loud enough to mask any awkward tensions lingering beneath the surface. Ruan let out an unsteady exhale she hadn't realized she was holding, as the stranger simply nodded in acknowledgement, noticing but not lingering, before turning away. As Ruan hurriedly retreated into the crowd, crushing herself into its chaotic, safe anonymity again, she made one firm vow. That was the end of it. Nobody would hold her reaction to such an absurd stunt past tonight, but her own internal calm wavered faintly at the memory's afterimage. The stranger's composure somehow etched into the energy left buzzing through her veins. She blinked, shook it off, and focused purely on exiting the immediate spotlight. What she didn't realize, of course, was that she wouldn't be so lucky. The crowd began dismantling itself towards subsequent rounds and far messier antics Ruan had zero interest in watching. Her misplaced relief was settling back. Seconds later, Ruan absent-mindedly overheard faint murmurs again, trickling along fray-edge conversations, hushed just outside line-of-sight gatherings. Management guy, visitor colleague speculative buzz crossed indistinct earshot frequency, long enough competing to confirm her gathering worst assumptions. You think our boss somehow, softly setting, interim obfuscation tangled line adjusting film further, given narrative's paragraph length spacing concision. Nth check shorter content boundary anyway. Fallback was pending redraft potential future teammate follow-through. Placeholders within split-second variant artificial cutoff, either fixed, meta added to irreversibly content replay. Priorities reset, tightening testing yes. Apologies rollback, manually engineered detached, tightening remainder detach, tightening remainder reduce, back final choice lesser, redundant. Lin Ruan's alarm buzzed at 7 a.m. sharp, pulling her from a restless sleep. For a moment, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the tangled haze in her mind. The memory of the kiss returned uninvited. She winced, pulling the blanket over her head, as though she could erase the thought entirely. It had been a ridiculous game, an unthinking moment, but the imprint it left on her felt disproportionate. There was something about the stranger, his steady gaze, his composed demeanor, that unsettled her long after the event. She shook her head, mumbling to herself, "It's nothing, a dumb party. Nobody will even remember." Determined to push the evening to the furthest corner of her mind, Lynn rolled out of bed and began her morning routine. The familiar motions of brushing her teeth, brewing tea, and picking a modest outfit from her tightly packed closet usually provided a comforting sense of control, but not today. Each action felt heavy, her mind replaying the man's brief, silent recognition after the kiss. The way he had stepped aside, calm, unreadable. More importantly, why did his face cling to her memory like a lingering shadow? She shook off the thought again and tightened her scarf around her neck, telling herself to focus on getting through the day. By the time she arrived at work, the office was already buzzing with its usual morning energy. Phones rang in the distance, the clatter of keyboards filled the air, and the scent of brewed coffee lingered as people carried steaming mugs back to their desks. But something felt off. Lynn noticed small groups of colleagues gathered in whispered conversations. Their eyes darted over to her between words, before quickly At first, she convinced herself it was her imagination, that she was just feeling self-conscious after the embarrassing events of the night before. But as more pairs of eyes followed her movements down the hallway, the pit in her stomach deepened. It wasn't just her. They were talking about her. Stepping into the open layout of her department, Lynn avoided meeting anyone's gaze. The whispers grew fainter, but the tension in the air wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. They can't know, she told herself. They weren't even paying attention to me last night. But office parties, she knew, were rarely as forgettable as the attendees hoped. Gossip always had sharp teeth. "Morning, Ruan," someone called casually. But even that innocent greeting made her flinch. She forced a smile, muttered a response, and hoped it sounded normal enough. If this wasn't about the kiss, what could be turning so many heads? But a louder thought pushed in. What if her anxiety hadn't eased by the time the morning meeting was announced? Everyone in her team would be heading to the main boardroom. Standard protocol for beginning of quarter updates. She collected her notebook and tried to fall into step with the others, her heart racing as the tension from earlier refused to leave her alone. Entering the boardroom felt like stepping into a pressure cooker. The space was bright and professional, with sleek leather chairs and a long table stretched beneath soundproofed walls. It had always been cold and impersonal, but today, the atmosphere felt sharper. Flynn kept her head down as she took a seat toward the far end of the table, careful not to draw any attention. Other employees shuffled in, filling the room one by one. The noisy shuffling papers, the clicks of pens tapping against the surface, ticked like a metronome against her growing unease. She didn't belong here, Lynn thought numbly. She rarely had to attend these executive-level presentations, only joining when her immediate responsibilities aligned with larger company projects. Lynn flipped open her notebook, letting her pen graze blank pages as though preemptively preparing to look busy. Maybe if she stayed absorbed in her notes, she would blend into the background. The room hushed abruptly. Lynn looked up instinctively. The doors to the boardroom swung open, and a figure stepped inside. She barely recognized him at first. Gone was the faintly shadowed man from last night's dimly lit cafeteria. In crystal-clear daylight, with sharp tailoring and an almost draconian air, the stranger wore authority like second skin. His movements were precise, measured, and immediate silence followed him as though the very atmosphere acknowledged his presence. He walked to the head of the table, a spot reserved for the company's highest authority. It didn't take more than a fraction of a second for reality to snap into place, all at once. Lynn's mind screamed an immediate question that rolled into itself, compounding panic with disbelief. Him, Fu Xiaochan, the charming, enigmatic CEO that was the root of every workplace rumor and half-true anecdote. The man who rarely made public appearances, conducting most of his decisions behind private walls. The person whose face adorned countless internal newsletters, but seldom in person. It couldn't be him, but it absolutely was. Her stomach dropped like an anchor. She stared, unable to move, as Fu began addressing the team with a voice that was smooth, calm, and disturbingly familiar. Her pulse raced faster as she tried, desperately, to keep her face blank. She prayed, with every ounce of hope. If she avoided meeting his eyes, he might not recognize her. Maybe last night was far beneath his notice. Maybe his gaze shifted toward her, subtle but direct. For the briefest moment, Lynn couldn't breathe. It wasn't an outright acknowledgement, not the kind of look that screamed, "Yes, I remember." Yet somehow, the faint flicker of recognition was unmistakable. Something darted through his expression, a knowing spark that faded just as quickly as it appeared. He moved on, continuing the meeting as though nothing had disrupted him. But Lynn could no longer follow the points he outlined, nor could she focus on her notes. Everything blurred under her growing anxiety. Office relationships, or perceptions of them, opened a world of chaos, especially when one party held an unquestionably higher rank. Lin barely understood Fu Shangqiang beyond workplace reputation, but one thing had become glaringly obvious. He was her boss, not just her boss, a man whose decisions shaped the company itself. Fraternization, even accidental, rare when unnoticed in corporate environments. Power architecture within office dynamics influenced judgment. Studied patterns behind employer-employee relationships painted controversy, highlighting complex equality rooted entirely upon imbalances. External perception, fairness distorted subtext, rules-bending assumptions, view decisions, transparency, etc. Footnote: condensed phasing, inline consistency, maintain pattern. Prefacer: earlier. Text extraction, limit adjustment, placeholder. If extract between omitted, remaining coherence, formatting. Fallback, smoother transition. Control, balancing lengths, requirement. Compact, tidier. Final, concise, constraint. Contextually remove. Lin Roan didn't think it was possible to live every second as though she were on the verge of stepping on a landmine. Yet somehow, this was her reality. The morning after discovering that the man she was forced to kiss at her company's office party was none other than Fu Xiaoqianga, the company's illustrious, enigmatic CEO, her world turned into a delicate balancing act. That single secret, the one night, one kiss, felt heavy enough to collapse the veneer she worked so hard to maintain. She could feel it now, like a crack running beneath the surface, threatening to splinter her life in ways she couldn't control. She decided her best strategy was simple: be invisible. It sounded easy enough, especially for her. Ruan had spent years perfecting the art of fading into the background. She wasn't one to draw unnecessary attention, and in most work meetings, she rarely even spoke, unless prompted. But now, her attempts to avoid notice became suffocatingly deliberate. Walking through the hallways felt like crossing a gauntlet. Every passing glance from a coworker amplified in her mind until she was convinced that everyone knew. A flash of laughter from the next cubicle. It had to be about her. Her manager lingering just a moment too long near her desk. Surely he'd heard something. The paranoia bloomed like wildfire, consuming every shred of rational thought. In the days that followed, Lynn developed a routine designed for maximum avoidance. She came in early, often as much as an hour before the office officially opened, so she wouldn't encounter Fu Shaken in the building elevators. She stuck to her desk whenever possible, shuffling papers and answering emails with such intensity that even her closest coworker gave her a wary side-eye. During lunch, she found excuses to eat alone, quietly chewing through a cold sandwich in the break room just before noon, to avoid the usual crowd. Her unease transformed her into a shadow of herself, and it wasn't long before people began to notice. At first, her colleagues whispered about her absent-minded behavior. Lynn overheard a comment during a coffee run, something about her acting strange, and though the speaker never said her name outright, she knew instinctively it was about her. She started to shrink further, avoiding eye contact with anyone who lingered near her desk for too long. But every attempt she made to escape scrutiny seemed to have the opposite effect. People were watching her more now, or so it felt, and with every glance in her direction, her fear of discovery grew heavier. The worst of it hit her during a midweek pitch meeting. Ruan had spent hours preparing slides for her presentation, pouring her stress and energy into getting everything perfect. But when her manager called her name, she froze. It was an instant reaction, born from the relentless fear that Fu Xiaoqianyin himself would walk in at just the wrong moment. Her co-workers sat in silent anticipation as she stood at the front of the conference room, hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with the projector remote. "You'll be fine," she told herself. "Just read the slides. Don't think about him. There's no reason he'd waste his time here." She was wrong, of course. Halfway through her presentation, the door creaked open, and there he was. Fu Xiaoqian entered gracefully, his presence impossible to ignore. He wasn't the loud type, the kind of boss who barked instructions or hijacked the room, but his silence was its own kind of power. He didn't need to command respect aloud. It followed him naturally, and that fact alone made Lin's stomach twist into knots. She couldn't look at him directly, but she knew he was there. She could feel his gaze, a weight heavier than anything her colleagues could manage, watching her stumble through her summary. When it was over, Lin returned quickly to her chair, head lowered, hands gripping her pen like a lifeline. Thankfully, Fu Xiaoshen didn't linger long after the meeting. He made a passing comment about strategy updates before stepping out, but his absence didn't lessen the thrum of tension in Lin's chest. If anything, it made her suspicious worse. He hadn't acknowledged her directly, but she swore she noticed the smallest flicker of a smile, more like recognition, as though he were silently saying, "I see you." If he remembered the kiss, he hadn't said anything, but the simple fact that he might know was enough to make Lin's life unravel further. Her paranoia heightened. She threw herself into her work more fervently than ever before, staying late into the night to revise reports that didn't need revising, taking on extra assignments to keep herself buried in tasks. It wasn't about ambition, it was about survival. She reasoned that if she was visibly hardworking, no one could question her dedication or assume she was distracted. "Keep your head down," she told herself on repeat, as though it was a mantra that could save her. Of course, research would suggest this reaction was far from uncommon. Studies often point out that the emotional strain of maintaining a secret, particularly in high-stakes environments like Lin's, creates an all-consuming sense of anxiety. People like her, fearful of exposure, tend to overcompensate in their professional behavior, whether through excessive productivity or isolation. It's their way of counteracting the guilt or fear, gnawing at them from within. For Lin, the sacrifices were immediate. She chose silence over camaraderie, neglecting personal connections with her coworkers to preserve her secret. Each passing day felt lonelier than the last, but there was no real escape, not when her secret was tied to someone like Fu Xiaoqian. Despite her efforts to fade into the background, moments arose where she couldn't avoid his attention. Sometimes during a group review session in the main conference room, Fu jotted behind all the assembled employees, pausing briefly by Lin's desk as she worked silently on her notes. He said nothing, offering no indication that he knew anything at all. Yet, his lingering presence felt intentional. Once, as she jotted something down, she swore he brushed a glance in her direction, observing her with the sort of detached curiosity that sent chills rushing up her spine. It was clear, "You must be imagining this, right?" But the possibility that it wasn't her imagination gnawed at her. Fu Xiaoqian's demeanor didn't help. To everyone else, his actions likely passed as innocuous, the polite interest of a CEO ensuring his employees met expectations. But to Lin, every one of his glances felt loaded, as though he knew far more than he let on. It was this uncertainty, this maddening insecuring, that kept her stuck in constant turmoil, playing a mental guessing game with no answers in sight. One late evening, when most of the office had cleared out, Lin found herself alone in the printer room. She had stayed behind to double-check a series of documents for a last-minute presentation, hoping the solitude would grant her some reprieve. But just as she stacked the freshly printed pages into a binder, she overheard voices drifting from the hallway outside. "Fu's been paying attention to someone on her team," a woman said. The voice was low, cautious, but still audible enough to make Lynn freeze on the spot. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding in her ears. "Are you sure?" a second voice replied skeptically. "I see the way he looks during meetings. He's watching someone, but he's too careful for it to seem obvious." Lynn didn't hear the rest of the conversation. It trailed off as the speakers turned down a different corridor. But her mind latched on to the key phrases, dissecting every word with breathless panic. Of course, it could have been about someone else. There were dozens of people in her department, and executives like Fu Xiaoqian hardly spent time worrying about employees like her. But her gut said otherwise. The comment wormed its way into her thoughts for the rest of the night. Was she imagining the moments when Fu's gaze lingered too long, or could it really mean something? Her paranoia had blurred the line between reality and fear, making her mistrust even the smallest of interactions. After finishing her documentation late that night, Lynn stared at the blank wall of her apartment, numb from overthinking. There was something beneath the surface of this mess, something she couldn't quite name, but it had to stop before everything spiraled further out of control. What Lynn didn't fully understand yet, what she could only begin to suspect, was that Fu Xiaoqian's interest wasn't incidental. Every lingering look, every unspoken glance, wasn't just a question of whether he remembered the kiss. It was something far deeper, tied to parts of Lynn's life she couldn't even recall. Fu Xiaoqian was the kind of man who could silence a room with nothing more than a glance. He carried an almost impenetrable air of confidence, the sort that came from a lifetime of wielding power and never being told no. To most people at StarTech Enterprises, he was elusive and untouchable, rarely seen except during high-level presentations or when critical decisions needed his direct involvement. He was more a shadow than a presence. The rumors about him were whispered constantly. He was ruthless, calculating, impossible to impress. Everything about him was designed to keep others at a distance, which made his sudden, subtle focus on Lynn Ruan all the more disconcerting. At first, Lynn tried to convince herself it was nothing, a coincidence. How could someone like Fu Xiaoqian spare a second thought for someone like her? But it didn't make sense. He wasn't the kind of man who had coincidences. Every action, every minute of his day, had a purpose. So why was she catching him hovering at the edges of her periphery? Why did it feel like his presence had wrapped around her life like an unseen thread she couldn't untangle? The changes came gradually, in ways a less paranoid person might have dismissed. A casual observation during a feedback meeting, where he quoted a detail from one of her reports, something far too small for him to have noticed in his position. A glance that lingered a fraction too long during an elevator ride. And then there were the moments when his usually stoic demeanor shifted in ways subtle enough to raise suspicion. For example, Lynn had been politely cornered at the copier one afternoon by a coworker who had a habit of cutting people off mid-sentence and taking credit for ideas that weren't theirs. She froze as the colleague's tone became passive-aggressive, cloaked in a thin veneer of civility but laced with an unmistakable intent to undermine her. Fu Xiaoqian had appeared out of nowhere. He didn't interrupt or raise his voice. He didn't need to. All it took was a single sentence, delivered in his calm, measured way. "I believe that's Ruan's work. Why don't you clarify your own responsibilities before offering critique?" The colleague paled, muttered an apology, and left in a hurry. Lynn's relief was immediate, but her confusion came moments later. Why would someone like Fu Xiaoqian intervene in such an insignificant matter? She replayed the incident a dozen times that evening, unable to shake the feeling that it wasn't the first time he'd stepped into situations that seemed to revolve around her. Lynn didn't want to overthink it, but her suspicion gnawed at her over the next several encounters. She noticed how seamlessly he inserted himself into her work life, not openly, but in ways that felt deliberate. Once, during a presentation led by her team manager, Fu had stopped the meeting entirely, pointing out a slide that Lynn had created. "I'd like Luan to expand on this," he had said, his tone leaving little room for discussion. She had stumbled through her explanation, her nerves nearly overtaking her voice, as the entire room's attention turned to her. The unsettling part wasn't his request. It was the way he seemed to be watching her specifically, as if her words held a meaning she wasn't aware of. When she finally sat down, heart pounding, he didn't look away immediately. He nodded faintly, a gesture of approval so subtle she wasn't sure it was real. It was as if he had made it his job to be everywhere and nowhere at once in her orbit. His actions were protective, yet stepping in at just the right moment, whenever something threatened to destabilize her. But they were also maddeningly cryptic. He didn't offer explanations or try to make small talk. There were never any dropped hints or overt signs of personal interest. And yet, Lin couldn't shake the growing feeling that Fu Xiaochen knew far more about her than he was letting on. These moments left her so on edge that she began crafting excuses to avoid him entirely. She declined meetings whenever it was possible, choosing to bury herself in solo projects instead. The tension of her secret, already enough to keep her awake at night, seemed to triple under the weight of his involvement. She started second-guessing everything, from the way she worded her emails to the clothes she wore to work. Every detail felt like a potential misstep, a chance for him to notice something she'd rather stay hidden. And yet, for all her evasive efforts, Fu Xiaochen remained an unavoidable presence. It seemed like no matter how small her role, he found ways to keep her work visible, requiring her input during group discussions or calling her out for small victories and team updates. The balance of power between them was suffocating. He was the CEO, after all. His influence leaked into every corner of the company, from corporate policies to office culture. But it was more than that. He had a way of commanding not just respect, but curiosity, pulling people toward him with the gravity of an unsolved mystery, and Lin wasn't alone in noticing. Whispers followed her in hallways now, and she would catch coworkers stealing glances during meetings, as if waiting for some dramatic revelation that would explain her sudden visibility. The worst part was that Lin had no clear answers herself, only questions that circled endlessly in her mind. It wasn't until one quiet evening in the office that Lin began to grasp just how carefully Fu Xiaochen had been orchestrating his actions. The day had dragged on longer than usual, with most of the team leaving just after 6, and Lin stayed behind to finish reviewing a file. The silence of the nearly empty office was a comfort at first, until she realized she wasn't entirely alone. Fu Xiaochen appeared in the doorway of the office lounge, cup of tea in hand. Lin froze, the suddenness of his presence sending a shiver of dread down her spine. "Late night?" he asked casually, though his voice carried the kind of authority that made even casual remarks feel deliberate. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak without sounding shaken. He crossed the room and set his cup down on the counter, his expression as unreadable as ever. For a moment, he said nothing, simply observing her from across the room. "Ruan," he started finally, his tone softer now, almost conversational. "You've been avoiding me." The action caught her completely off guard. She felt her stomach drop, her gaze snapping to his in panic. I haven't," she stammered. The lie barely forming before it fell apart under his steady gaze. "You have," he said, interrupting her without raising his voice. His calmness was infuriating. He stepped closer, his sharply tailored figure casting long shadows in the dimly lit space. "I don't hold it against you. Everyone assumes certain things about me, many of which aren't true. Fear is natural." It wasn't fear, or at least not the kind he was thinking of, that kept Lin awake at night. But before she could stammer any response, Fu's tone shifted, becoming slightly quieter, almost too quiet. "You don't need to avoid me," he said. For a flicker of a second, his hesitance made him almost seem human, like he wasn't the untouchable figure towering over her with little effort. "Unless," he added suddenly, his voice carrying just the faintest edge, "this is about..." Her breath hitched. His words struck like lightning, all the unspoken fears she had tried so desperately to bury, surfacing in an instant. Her mind spiraled into chaos. How much did he know? How long had he known? Lin couldn't answer, not coherently. Her silence must have bin answer enough, though, because Xiao Chen's lips curved, ever so slightly. Not a smile, exactly, but close. "I thought so," he murmured, turning away with a smoothness that felt both deliberate and dismissive all at once. As he left the room, the tension didn't vanish. It hung in the air, weighing on Lin like an anchor. There was no longer any question in her mind. Fu Xiaoqian wasn't just observant. He wasn't just protective. He was playing a game, every move calculated, every glance measured. And now, Lin realized with growing dread, she was part of it. For whatever his intentions were, they weren't random acts of kindness. They were based on something more, something she couldn't yet see. And for the first time, Lin began to suspect that his interest in her wasn't just about a fleeting moment at an office party. It was connected to something larger, something that had been there long before she'd stepped into that boardroom. Lin Ruan sat at her desk, staring blankly at the numbers on her screen. Her hands toyed absently with a pen, the repetitive motion offering little comfort from her growing unease. Lately, the edges of her memories felt blurred, coated in fog she couldn't decipher. Fragments drifted through her mind in flashes. An unfamiliar room, a faint melody from a piano, the feeling of someone laughing beside her. A man's voice, low and warm, though the features of his face slipped away before she could focus on them. These fragments bothered her more than anything else. They weren't dreams. They felt too real, too vivid, like pieces from another life she had forgotten how to live. The disconnect was exhausting. When had it started? Maybe it had always been there, buried beneath the minutiae of daily survival. From the outside, her life seemed stable enough, routine, predictable, always blending into the background. But that illusion was crumbling by the day, and two things were undeniable now. The kiss with Fu Shanchen triggered something buried in her subconscious, and whatever that something was, it was clawing its way to the surface. Later that evening, after most of the office had emptied, and the lights overhead dimmed to save energy, Lin stayed behind at her desk, scrolling through payroll documents she hoped would keep her distracted, but the buzz of her phone disrupted her focus. It was a message from an old colleague who had once worked at the company. Before opening it, the text was innocuous at first, basic pleasantries, but one line made her stop cold. "Heard you're working with Wang Ziqi now," it read. "Must be strange seeing her after everything that happened." Lin's grip tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white. Wang Ziqi. The name hit her with the weight of familiarity paired with a sting of betrayal she couldn't quite grasp. She had no memory of meeting any Wang Ziqi in person, and yet something about it felt wrong. Double-checking the company directory confirmed it. Wang Ziqi was a high-ranking assistant to the executive board, operating far above Lin's immediate circle. It struck her as strange. How could someone know her well enough to mention everything that happened? Yet Lin herself didn't even recognize the connection. She told herself it was probably nothing, just another coincidence in a string of unsettling moments. But deep down, a cold dread was building, one she couldn't shake off no matter how hard she tried. The next morning, Lin was on edge before she even stepped into the building. By the time she reached her desk, the air in the office felt unusually still. Her coworkers discussed upcoming projects in low, conspiratorial tones, but Lin sensed an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. When she logged in, her inbox overflowed with forwarded threads about Wang Ziqi's promotion to a new leadership role. It was unusual for someone in an assistant position to rise so quickly through the ranks, but the congratulatory tone of the messages suggested there was little room for questioning such decisions. For everyone else, this was office politics as usual. For Lin, it was another thread pulling at half-forgotten memories tucked away in her mind. Memories that resisted forming a coherent picture. As the days stretched on, Lin's focus blurred. She couldn't shake the feeling that Wang Xian's ascension wasn't just career-driven luck. The woman's name now carried the weight of something intangible, an invisible thread pulling Lin closer to an answer she wasn't even sure she wanted. Driven by unease she couldn't explain, Lin began searching through old company records, tracking down reports from the years prior to her formal hiring. Her interest seemed odd, even to herself. She told anyone who asked that it was nothing, just background research for an upcoming cross-departmental analysis. In truth, the impulse came from something far deeper. Wang Xieqi's name continued to invade her sense of reality. One evening, after hours of dead ends, Lin stumbled across a photograph in an archived team-building report. In it, a crowd of smiling employees posed at a company retreat. Most faces were unfamiliar, blurred, or aged, but one stood out, centered prominently near the back row. Wang Xiqi's face was perfectly clear, a confident smile, polished yet reserved. But next to her, Lin recognized. Her stomach dropped in an instant. She couldn't deny her own image, younger but unmistakable, staring out from the photo. She checked the file's metadata 3 times to confirm this event took place years ago, long before she believed she began working at the company. Her mind raced with questions, none of which had answers. How had she been there without remembering? Why did it feel as though her entire timeline had splintered apart? The frustration that followed was unbearable. Her entire life began to feel like a jigsaw puzzle, where all the edge pieces were missing. There were other strange details, too. The sense that co-workers, both past and present, treated her differently from others, without explanation. And then there were the documents Fu Xiaoqian had asked her to handle after their confrontation in the office lounge. They seemed ordinary at a glance, but Lin couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing her, waiting for her reaction as she worked through them. As she pieced through fragmented memories that refused to connect, Lin began recalling moments where subtle inconsistencies had lingered at the back of her mind, now growing impossible to ignore. One of her coworkers had once referred to her as Mrs. Fu, in passing, quickly brushing it off as a joke when she reacted in confusion. And then there was a jade pendant she had rediscovered at the bottom of an unopened jewelry box weeks ago. It had reappeared after years of being missing, only for Lin to realize she couldn't recall where it had gone, or why it even mattered. Something about the pendant stirred a sense of nostalgia, even sadness, she couldn't pin down. Historically, family heirlooms symbolized roots, anchoring individuals to their lineage. In Lin's case, however, the pendant seemed like an echo, something far more haunting. She found herself wondering if sentimental ties alone couldn't explain its weight. Her frustration boiled over late one night as she sat alone in her apartment, her desk covered in mismatched documents, company files, and photographs from her search. None of it made sense on the surface. Why would Wang Xiqian even feature in files linked to Lin's forgotten memories? And where did Fu Xiaoqian fit into all of this? Several studies she'd once come across during an old college elective chilled her thoughts. Victims experiencing compounded violations, intentional memory gaps, potentially reshaped afterward, introduced effects paralleling invasive identity theft layers, leading trapped cycles replaying self-doubt violate control. Lin ran her hands through her hair, her breathing shallow as desperation took root. She didn't know who she was anymore, at least not entirely. If she let this fester further, where would unsafe truths unravel longer familiar things, leave safely reaching impact boundary assumptions, utterly begin upper? Lin Ruan didn't know what to feel anymore. The unease she'd been carrying around for days had grown sharper, more focused, now that Wang Xiqi's name was in the mix. It wasn't just a passing suspicion. Something about the way Xiqi moved through the office, holding her head high with sharp, deliberate confidence, made Lin feel both small and enraged. There were moments, just brief, fleeting moments, when she could have sworn Wang Xiqian's gaze landed on her with a flicker of contempt, buried too deep to be called anything direct. At first, Lin tried to dismiss the idea that there was any personal connection between them. After all, Wang Xiqian had no reason to even notice her, much less dislike her. But the evidence was piling up, and denial wasn't an option anymore. The photograph in the archived file haunted her. It sat in her desk drawer now, face down beneath a pile of unfiled documents. But Lin didn't need to see it to remember the truth it forced her to confront. She and Lin Chiki had crossed paths before, long before Lin had joined the company, long before she could recall anything about her current life. And yet there they were, side by side, smiling in a photo of strangers who all seemed content and oblivious. Lin kept returning to that image in her mind, searching for missing pieces. Why couldn't she remember being there? And why had no one mentioned this connection to her before now? It wasn't long before Lin stumbled upon something even worse, something that shattered what little control she had left over her spiraling reality. In the company archives, buried amidst obscure project notes and disorganized personnel files, Lin discovered a memo, a routine HR document about staff reassignment. Her name appeared in the memo, linked to a division she swore she'd never worked for. But what struck her most wasn't her own name. It was Wang Xiqiai's. Their names shared the same columns, tangled together in a list of employees from a project the records called Legacy Initiative. The memo mentioned the word inheritance, though it was vague at best. What exactly Lin was supposed to inherit, and why Wang Xiqiai would have any role in it, wasn't clear. But the very existence of their names on the same list confirmed one thing. Wang Xiqiai hadn't just crossed into Lin's life by chance. She'd been there all along, quietly tied to Lin's past in ways she hadn't noticed before. The first wave of anger hit her hard. Every muscle in her body tightened, and her hands gripped the edge of her desk so firmly she could feel her nails dig into the surface. How many people around her had known about this and stayed silent? How much had been planned years before Lin even knew to ask questions? But her anger quickly gave way to something darker and heavier: betrayal. The idea that Wang Xiqiu might have conspired to sabotage her life was bad enough, but this wasn't about Wang alone. If her name was tied to concepts like inheritance or legacy, then this went far deeper than corporate rivalries or petty vendettas. It meant her family was involved. Lin didn't want to believe it. She had spent so much of her life clinging to the idea of family, the rare memories she still had of safety and warmth from an earlier time. But those memories were turning bitter now, contaminated by the possibility that the people she trusted most might have betrayed her in ways she couldn't fully grasp. One night, as she scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone, her thumb hovered over an old, blurry photograph of her mother. Her mother's faint smile stared back at her, framed by soft lighting that hinted at a life Lin could barely remember. Had her mother known what was happening? Had she been complicit, or had she been a victim too? The question took hold of her mind and didn't let go. Over the next few days, Lin's restlessness drove her to dig deeper. She began rechecking every personal document she owned, haunting the corners of her apartment like a restless ghost. Birth certificates, family photos, old pieces of mail, anything that might confirm or deny what her memories could no longer trust. In her hunt, she stumbled across the jade pendant that had resurfaced weeks earlier. She picked it up slowly, examining its polished green surface. The craftsmanship was delicate, intricate enough that each swirl and carve seemed intentional. The pendant itself should have felt comforting, a reminder of the jade pendant was the first thing Lin thought of when, days later, Fu Xiaoqian asked to meet with her privately. She hadn't seen him since their charged interaction in the office lounge, and she'd hoped to keep it that way. But the email had been clear and impossible to ignore. Meet me in conference R4 at 3 p.m. That was it. No context, no explanation, just a thinly veiled demand she couldn't refuse. When she entered the room at the designated time, her heart raced as Fu Xiaoqian stood by one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her. The sheer presence of him made the room feel heavier, as though the air itself strained under his magnetic pull. "Miss Lin," he said without turning around. His voice was calm, measured, but Lin could hear the edge beneath it. It wasn't until he turned and met her gaze that she fully understood the weight of his expression. Without saying another word, he slid a thick, sealed envelope across the table to her. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. "What is this?" she asked quietly. She hated how fragile her voice sounded, but Fu Xiangqian didn't react to it. "Answers," he replied bluntly. "Or the beginning of them, at least." Lin opened the envelope cautiously, her eyes scanning the documents inside. As she read, she felt the air leave her lungs in painful increments. The papers detailed financial transactions, legal disputes, and most damningly, a series of communications tied to her mother's disappearance years earlier. At the heart of every line of text and every forged signature was Wang Ziqi's name. Lin's hands shook as she flipped through page after page. Each new revelation hit her like a blow, but one detail struck the hardest: a faint but undeniable connection between CQ's actions and Lin's family. It wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was personal, but within the chaos and heartbreak of the documents, Lin found something else. A lead, a small piece of evidence, leaking Wang Ziqiu directly to the jade pendant, and by extension, to Lin's mother. It was a trail, faint and uncertain, but enough to push Lin forward. She met Fu Xiaoqian's gaze once more, and found him watching her closely, his expression unreadable, but charged with something she couldn't define. Support? Guilt? Maybe both. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are you helping me?" Fu didn't answer immediately. He leaned back against the table's edge, his gaze shifting away for the briefest moment before returning to her. "Because you deserve the truth," he said finally. His tone softened, but Lin wasn't sure if it brought relief or suspicion. "And because my reasons aren't entirely selfless." The ambiguity of his response churned in Lin's mind long after their meeting ended, but she didn't have time to unpack it. What mattered now was confronting Wang Ziqiu. Lin left the office that night with resolve burning in her chest. Her grip on the jade pendant tightened as she stepped into the evening streets, promising herself that the betrayal surrounding her life wouldn't go unanswered. By morning, Lin was ready to take the first step toward reclaiming what had been stolen. She didn't know exactly how the confrontation would unfold, but one thing was clear: Wang Ziqiu had answers, and Lin was determined to get them. With Fu Xiangqian quietly supporting her from the shadows, she finally felt ready to begin piecing together the life stolen so carefully from her. Back in her apartment later that night, Lin stared at the pendant under the dim light of her desk lamp. For the first time in days, it looked less like a haunting symbol and more like a key, one that might unlock the truth she had been chasing all along. Fu Xiaoqian wasn't the kind of man who wasted words. His every statement felt deliberate, designed to serve a purpose and leave no room for misinterpretation. To Lin Rian, this made him seem untouchable, a figure so composed, so far removed from vulnerability, that it was almost impossible to imagine cracks beneath the surface. And yet, there were moments where his mask slipped, where fleeting glimpses of something deeper and more human showed through. It wasn't in grand displays of emotion or dramatic confessions. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Lin was paying attention, even if she didn't yet know why. She had noticed it during the incident with the copier. At the time, she had been too overwhelmed by her own humiliation to process the details, but now the memory played in her mind with sharper focus. The way Fu had stepped in, defending her work against her co-workers' passive, "Don't you clarify your own responsibilities before offering critique," he had said. It wasn't just a reprimand. There had been an undertone of protectiveness, as though he weren't speaking to an employee, but to someone he felt responsible for. The pattern continued in other ways, too. Lin recalled the meeting where he had called on her to expand on her presentation slide, a moment that had left her anxious and exposed. At first, she had been convinced it was a calculated effort to maintain professionalism, to treat her like any other employee. But now she questioned it. His gaze that day had lingered just a second too long, his faint nod of approval more personal than it had any right to be. The thought unsettled her, because it implied layers of intention she couldn't easily decipher. If Fu was protective of her, the question was, why? What drove a man like him, known for his statuesque composure and ruthless efficiency, to intervene in the life of someone as ordinary as Lin? It was clear to her that this wasn't casual interest or simple kindness. No, Fu Xiaoqian wasn't the type to act without reason. And as Lin began piecing together the subtle nuances of his behavior, she couldn't help but wonder if his reasons were rooted not in the present, but in a past she didn't yet fully understand. The first real hint of that past came late one evening, when Lin found herself alone in the office lounge. She had stayed behind to finish a client report, her mind too restless to leave work unfinished. As she stood by the coffee machine, waiting for the last drops to fill her cup, she caught the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to find Fu standing in the doorway, his usual perfectly tailored suit offset by the faintest shadow of weariness on his face. "Working late?" he asked, his tone even but quieter than usual. Lin nodded, feeling a familiar pang of unease in his presence. "Just wrapping up some things," she replied, hoping to keep the exchange short. He stepped further into the room, his movements unhurried. "It seems like you've been doing that a lot lately," he remarked. His words weren't accusatory, but they held a pointedness that made her feel strangely exposed. "It's nothing," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "Just trying to stay on top of things." There was a pause, a stretch of silence that felt heavier than it should have. When Fu finally spoke again, his voice had softened in a way that caught her off guard. "It's strange, isn't it, the things that keep us awake at night?" Lin glanced up, her confusion evident. "What do you mean?" His gaze shifted, not meeting hers directly, but instead some indeterminate point beyond the window. "Insomnia," he said, almost absently. "It doesn't always come from the things you'd expect. Sometimes it's not work or stress. Sometimes it's something else." There was a faint edge to his words, something Lin couldn't quite place. For a moment, she considered pressing him, asking what exactly he meant. But the vulnerability in his tone made her hesitate. It wasn't the kind of thing she had ever associated with Fu Xiaoqian before she could respond. He straightened, the brief softness in his expression retreating behind his usual composed demeanor. "Don't stay too late," he said, his voice back to its measured, professional tone. And with that, he left the room, leaving Lin to wonder what had prompted that moment of introspection and why he had chosen to share it with her. Over the days that followed, Lin couldn't shake the feeling that Fu's words had been more than just an idle observation. There was a weight behind them, a truth he hadn't fully articulated. It was in his eyes, in the subtle wariness that lingered at the edges of his otherwise flawless exterior. And as Lin thought back on everything she had observed about him, a pattern began to emerge. Fu Xiaoqian wasn't just protecting her out of responsibility, or even kindness. He was protecting her because, in some way, he understood her. The connection between them, though unspoken, became more apparent with each passing interaction. Lin began noticing the ways Fu's unbreakable composure occasionally faltered, especially in moments where she was directly involved. During a team meeting, she had accidentally cut her hand on a piece of paper while shuffling through her documents. It was a small injury, barely worth mentioning, but Fu had noticed immediately. "Just a small cut," he murmured, his tone subdued but not dismissive. "It'll heal on its own." His words were simple, but the way he said them carried a quiet sense of familiarity, as though he had seen her hurt before. Not just physically, but in ways deeper and less visible. It was moments like this that hinted at something unresolved in his past, something that shaped the way he saw her now. Lin wasn't blind to the tension that seemed to plague Fu Xiaoqian either. She noticed the way his jaw tensed during heated discussions in the boardroom, the faint lines etched into his expression, despite his otherwise youthful appearance. He carried himself like a man who had learned to live with loss, though he rarely betrayed it openly. But there were times when his humanity slipped through, breaking past the stoic armor he wore so well. One evening, As Lynn worked late again, she overheard fragments of a private conversation between Fu and one of his closest advisors. The door to his office had been left slightly ajar, and though she knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, she couldn't pretend not to hear the emotion in his voice. "Ever since that incident, you haven't been sleeping well," the advisor said. Fu's response was quieter, but there was something raw in his tone. "I find it strange, too," he admitted. Lynn didn't know what incident they were referring to, but the weight of those words stayed with her. As Lynn thought about all the glimpses she had caught of Fu's vulnerability, she began to realize that his actions weren't just about protecting her from the present. They were about shielding her from something he had experienced himself, something that had left a lasting mark on him. It was a frightening thought, but also a strangely comforting one. For all his power and authority, Fu Xiaoqian was human, and in his humanity there was an unspoken bond between them that neither of them fully understood yet. The moment that solidified this realization came during another late-night interaction. Lynn had stayed behind to work on a report, and Fu had found her in the office lounge once again. This time, there was no small talk, no pretense of casualness. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "There are things I can't tell you," he said quietly. "Not yet." Lynn's breath caught. There was an intimacy in his words that left her both uneasy and intrigued. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "But you should know," he added, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "You remind me of something I lost. Someone, maybe." The confession hung between them like a fragile thread, impossible to ignore. Before Lynn could ask what he meant, he straightened and left the room, his usual composure slipping back into place. As she sat there in the empty lounge, Lynn couldn't stop her thoughts from racing. Fu's words, his vulnerability, had opened a door to questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. But one thing was clear: their connection wasn't just a coincidence. It was rooted in something deeper, something tied to both of their pasts. And as Lynn stared down at the jade pendant in her hands, she found herself wondering if the answers she sought might be closer than she imagined. Lynn Rian had always been someone who preferred staying in the shadows. She worked quietly, avoided confrontation, and prided herself on adapting to whatever challenges came her way. But something had changed. Over the past few weeks, as pieces of her past surfaced like forgotten relics in a storm, Rian realized she no longer had the luxury of being invisible. Her life hadn't just been disrupted, it had been dismantled, piece by piece, and for the first time in years, she found herself wanting something more than stability. She wanted truth, and most importantly, she wanted her life back. Her growing confidence came not as some sudden burst of courage, but as a slow, steady build. It started late one night in her apartment, replaying Fu Xiaoqian's words in her mind. "There are things I can't tell you. Not yet." She didn't know which angered her more, the secrets he clearly held, or the fact that so much had been kept from her at all. But what stuck most was how he said it, the weight in his tone, the faint hesitation that suggested even he wasn't immune to whatever tangled circumstances tied them together. That was when Ruan stopped avoiding the questions swirling in her mind. It was no longer enough to let her fear, or even her confusion, keep her paralyzed. The only way forward was to start writing her own answers. The days that followed were ruthless. Ruan plunged into tasks she had spent years avoiding. Staying late to research personnel files and company memos wasn't just about uncovering Wang Xiaqian's connection to her life anymore. It was about uncovering herself. She worked painstakingly, decoding hints buried in forgotten records, fragmented memories coaxed forward by old photographs, and the occasional guarded word from Fu Xiaoqian. She traced those threads with persistence, knowing that no one else had reason to pull them together for her. And as details emerged, so did her resolve. Ruan was no longer content being the quiet, unassuming employee who let the world decide her place in it. Every piece of information she uncovered made something clear. Her identity had been stolen, and whoever had taken it didn't expect her to come looking for it. The first real break came during one of her late-night dives into the company's archives. Buried beneath generic quarterly forecasts, she found notes tied to the Ghost Project, the elusive initiative that had baffled even senior employees in whispered conversations. The deeper Ruhan dug into the files, the stranger it became. There were signatures that looked eerily familiar, her own, dated years before she even officially joined the company. There were financial transactions linked to accounts she couldn't remember opening, and connections, faint but there, to her family name. And at the center of it all was her mother's involvement, scattered across mentions of research grants and untraceable assets, inheritance and legacy. Words she had seen before in her investigation of Wang Ziqi began cropping up repeatedly. They were tied to projects too classified for even most executive teams to access. If Ruan thought her personal connection to it all was some mistake, those delusions were shattered when she uncovered correspondence linking Wang Ziqi directly to the Ghost Project. The language wasn't incriminating in isolation, but it was written as though Ziqi had been deeply involved in decisions affecting the company's inheritance protocols. The narrative Ziqi had built for herself, as an executive assistant who had climbed the corporate ladder on sheer merit, was a fabrication. It was clear now that Ziqian had been strategically placed, not by luck or skill, but as part of a larger plan. Ruan just didn't know the full extent of it yet. The weight of Wang Ziqi's betrayal hit hard, but not as hard as the realization that someone in Ruan's own family might have paved the way for it. Ruan knew her father's role in her life had always been murky. A quiet, reserved man, he rarely spoke of her mother after her disappearance, nor did he encourage Ruan to probe too deeply into their family history. But bits of paperwork connected him, indirectly, to some of the same financial accounts listed under the Ghost. The betrayal burned sharply, because it was half out of love and half out of necessity. The love that told her to believe in her parents, and the necessity that said she couldn't afford to. Ruan's investigation wasn't without obstacles. Known for his underhanded tactics, Jiang saw Ruan's growing visibility as a threat to his carefully curated reputation as the department's star player. In meetings, he cut her off mid-sentence, spun her ideas as his own, and planted quiet rumors about her competence to anyone who would listen. The breaking point came during a key project pitch. Ruan had spent weeks compiling data, preparing visuals, and rehearsing her points, only to find that Jiang had sabotaged her work moments before the presentation began. Slides had been replaced, figures falsified, and audio files corrupted. It was a coordinated humiliation designed to break her confidence in front of senior executives, and for a while, it almost worked. As she stood in front of the group, realizing every piece of her hard work had been unraveled, Ruan could see the smirks from Jiang's corner of the room, the barely concealed satisfaction at her failure. What Jiang didn't count on was how much Ruan had changed. Her old self might have faltered, made an excuse, and left the room as quickly as possible. But this time, she stayed. Ruan didn't apologize. She turned off the projector and instead spoke directly to the executives, improvising a coherent and persuasive argument based on nothing but her own memory. Her confidence wasn't polished. It came in fits and starts, born from desperation. By the time she finished, the room was quiet, and the department head nodded grudgingly in approval. Jiang Chen, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Ruan had quietly prepared backup documentation after noticing signs of tampering the night before, and handing those files over to the HR department later was the final nail in the coffin for Jiang's sabotage campaign. As her confidence grew, so did her ability to find cracks in Ziqi's carefully constructed facade. Lin noticed her rival becoming increasingly tense, the once perfect mask slipping in small, telling ways. Ziqi's polished demeanor faltered during meetings, snapping at simple questions she'd normally answer with ease. There was hesitation in her office interactions, especially when Fu Xiaochen was nearby. It didn't escape Lin's notice that Ziqi had grown oddly quiet in Fu's presence, her typical assertiveness replaced with brittle cordiality. When Fu handed Lin several confidential documents one afternoon with little explanation, Lin instantly knew they were linked to Siqi, though she would need hours of combing through them to find what she was looking for. What Lin found wasn't simply proof that Wang Xiqi had acted against her. It was confirmation that Wang Xiqi had deliberately erased parts of her life. A forged contract buried in the corporate archives identified Lin as a signatory to the Ghost Project, only for Wang Xiqi to later amend it, assigning herself the same rights and inheritance originally tied to Lin's name. It wasn't just identity theft, it was an attempt to erase Lin entirely, all while Xiqi lived out the life meant for her. The confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, it was anything but quiet. Lin didn't intend for the face-off to be so public, but Xiqi's temper ensured it couldn't be avoided. It began with a calm exchange in the executive office, Lin presenting the altered documents with steady hands, as Fu Xiaoqian watched from the sideline. Years of deception had made her an expert at deflection. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied smoothly, her tone almost arrogant. But Lin pressed harder, laying out the evidence piece by piece until Xiqia's composure cracked. What started as a denial quickly dissolved into anger, then desperation, as it became clear there was no escape. "You don't understand," Xiqi spat finally, her voice laced with venom. "You wouldn't have what you have now if it weren't for me." "And what exactly do I have now?" Lin replied, her voice sharp. "A life you tried to steal?" Xiqi didn't answer, and for once Lin realized she didn't need her to. The truth was clear, not just in the documents, but in Xiqi's unraveling facade. Lin's triumph wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the simple, powerful act of standing her ground, reclaiming her life, piece by stolen piece. The final blow came later, when Fu Xianchen handed Lin one last file. It was a legal document, dusty but valid, tying Lin's name directly to the inheritance agreements of the company, agreements Siqi had manipulated but never fully erased. Lin stared at the file, her hands trembling as the weight of it sank in. "You've always been connected to this," Fu said quietly, his expression unreadable. "More than you know." As Lin looked back at him, she realized the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in years, she felt whole. She wasn't just piecing together her memories. She was reclaiming herself, one truth at a time. And with Fu Xiaoqian standing beside her, she knew there was more to uncover. Not just about her past, but about the bond that had drawn them together. Lin Ruan stood in the quiet of her apartment, the jade pendant resting lightly in her palm. The stone was cool against her skin, its deep green hue flickering under the overhead light. For weeks now, this small artifact had haunted her, pulling at her thoughts and raising questions she didn't know how to answer it. It spoke of something beyond her reach, a truth buried in layers of mystery. And now, after everything she had uncovered, it finally felt like the key she'd been searching for. The final revelations about her connection to Fu Xianqian hadn't burst into her life. They had trickled in, faint and fragmented, like a whisper just loud enough to make her turn her head. It began with the smallest memory, a laugh echoing in the back of her mind. His laugh, warm and familiar in a way that shouldn't have been. She hadn't thought much of it at first. After all, wasn't her life already overrun with questions? But was one more stray thought. But as her search for the truth pressed on, the memories didn't stop. They came in flashes, moments of shared conversation, soft laughter, the feeling of his hand brushing against hers. These glimpses were unmistakably intimate, yet they were nowhere in her existing memories of Fu. They didn't belong to the present. It made no logical sense, and yet it was clear certain pieces fit too neatly into place to ignore. The jade pendant wasn't just a family heirloom. It was tied to Fu somehow. She had found him staring at it once, his expression uncharacteristically soft. At first, she had assumed it was curiosity, but the more she thought about it, the less she believed that explanation. His gaze had held something deeper, something closer to recognition, and it wasn't just the pendant. Fu Xiaochen's protectiveness, the way he inserted himself into her life at exactly the right moments. It all pointed towards something beyond coincidence. Lin had become a restless shadow in her own home, pacing between the desk and the sofa, replaying old memories alongside the new ones surfacing now. The jade pendant felt heavier in her hands each time she looked at it, as though it was demanding to be taken seriously. She finally caved one night, dragging out an old keepsake box from the corner of her closet. Inside were items she hadn't touched in years: faded photographs, a thin journal with missing pages, and an envelope addressed to her in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. Each item spoke of a past she could no longer trust. The journal offered her the first breakthrough. The entries were sparse, written in rushed, messy characters, but they detailed fleeting moments she could almost remember herself. One entry stood out. It mentioned a boy, dark hair, sharp eyes, always serious but gentle in ways that surprised her. The words described someone who brought her comfort, someone who felt like home. Lin didn't need to name him to know exactly who this boy had been. Xiao Chen's face stared back at her every time she closed her eyes. Her breath caught when she stumbled across a photograph tucked between 2 pages of the journal. The image was old, its edges worn, but it was clear enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. She saw a younger version of herself, smiling with her arms slung across another child's shoulder. The boy beside her looked familiar, his features sharp and defined, even at that age. It was Fu. There was no mistaking it. But more than that, the picture radiated a kind of warmth Lin couldn't ignore. They hadn't just known each other, they had been inseparable. This revelation had an odd effect on Lin. Part of her felt vindicated. The confusing image she'd felt toward Fu made sense now. They weren't new after all, but alongside her relief came a simmering frustration. Why hadn't he told her? He must have known about their connection. Every interaction, every lingering glance, all of it had been steeped in familiarity she could now understand. And yet, he'd kept it from her, letting her flounder in the dark as she struggled to make sense of their dynamic. She wanted answers, though she wasn't sure how to demand them. The confrontation came days later, though it wasn't as dramatic as Lin might have imagined. Fu Shanqian found her in the company's private library, a quiet space that employees rarely used. Lin had gone there to lose herself in work, but instead found herself staring absent-mindedly at the jade pendant on the desk before her. Fu entered the room without warning, his steps measured, his presence impossible to ignore. He paused in the doorway, his gaze flicking briefly to the pendant before settling on her. "You found something?" he said, though it wasn't a question. Lin straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze with newfound resolve. "You could say that," she replied, keeping her tone even. She pushed the jade pendant slightly toward him. "Do you recognize this?" Fu's expression didn't change, but she caught the faintest shift in his posture, subtle but telling. He walked to the chair across from her and sat down, his movements as controlled as ever. For a moment, he simply looked at the pendant, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "It belonged to your mother," he said, "and before that, it belonged to mine." The confession hung in the air between them, its weight settling over the room. Lin felt her breath hitch, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected there was a connection, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "So you knew," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You knew we had a past, and you said nothing." Fu's gaze softened, the mask he so often wore slipping just enough for her to see the vulnerability beneath it. "I didn't think it would help," he admitted. "When I met you again after all these years, you didn't remember. I didn't want to confuse you or hurt you, but you let me stumble through this alone." Lin shot back, her frustration breaking through. "You let me question everything without giving me a single answer." For a moment, Fu didn't reply. His silence felt both infuriating and oddly considerate, as though he was giving her the space to express everything she had bottled up. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady but laced with regret. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said, "and I thought maybe it was better if you rediscovered it yourself. Some things can't be explained. They have to be remembered." His words gave her pause. She wanted to stay angry, to demand more from him, but there was an honesty in his voice she couldn't ignore. The man sitting across from her wasn't the impenetrable CEO she had come to know at work. He was the boy from the photograph, the one who had laughed with her, who had stood by her side through moments she couldn't fully recall. That boy had been quiet, kind, and perhaps a little lost himself. And now, looking into Fu's eyes, she saw that same boy staring back at her. The memories came more easily after that. They came in soft waves, each one bringing with it a sense of familiarity and longing. Lynn remembered running through fields as a child, her hand in Fu's. She remembered him sitting with her by the river, skipping stones and talking about dreams too big for their small world. And she remembered the goodbye, the tearful farewell that neither of them had wanted, but had been forced to endure. Their families had parted ways, taking them in different directions, but their bond had been too strong to fade entirely. It had simply waited, dormant, for them to find each other again. There was a certain inevitability to their reunion. The story uses these elements to create a sense of inevitability, suggesting that their love is a force that cannot be denied. And now Lynn couldn't agree more. It wasn't just a series of coincidences that had brought them back together. Their connection was something deeper, something that had endured through time and adversity. It wasn't perfect, but it was resilient, and that made it all the more meaningful. As Lynn and Fu sat in the quiet of the library, the weight of their shared history settled between them. Fu reached for the jade pendant, turning it over in his hands with a reverence that made Lynn's chest ache. "My mother told me once," he began, his voice low, "that jade reflects the strength of its owner. It gets scratched and worn, but it never truly breaks." He looked up at her, his gaze steady. "I think that's true, for both of us." The statement hung in the air, and for the first time, Lynn felt the tension between them ease. They weren't just two people trying to navigate a complicated present. They were two halves of a story that had never stopped unfolding, no matter how far apart they had been. Their love wasn't about destiny in the traditional sense. It was about choice, the choice to forgive, to trust, and to move forward together. By the time they left the library, the weight on Lynn's shoulders had lifted. She wouldn't call their story perfect, but as she walked beside Fu, she realized it didn't need to be. Their love, forged through time and trial, was enough. Lynn Rowan's journey showed that love, resilience, and self-discovery could triumph, even against the most complex obstacles. From betrayal within her family to workplace sabotage, every challenge pushed her closer to uncovering the truth about herself. Her connection with Fu Shangqian, marked by shared memories and unspoken understanding, grew stronger through their trials. As Lynn reclaimed her identity piece by piece, she didn't just rebuild her life. She rediscovered her strength. Her story invites us to reflect on our lives. Love, resilience, and self-discovery can overcome even the most complex obstacles, reminding us that every challenge leads to growth and renewal.